Greetings from Cape Town, South Africa, and Nobel Square, the Nobel Monument here in downtown waterfront Cape Town. What's the Nobel Square all about? Because what you see here in these awesome statues are the 4 Nobel Peace Prize recipients, all from South Africa. In 1960, Albert Luthuli. From 1984, Desmond Tutu. And the pair on either side of me here is F.W. de Klerk, and of course, the ever awesome Nelson Mandela, who jointly won the Peace Prize in 1993. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, is why these two guys won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, and more importantly, this awesome guy named Nelson Mandela. A living legend, at least for a little bit longer, and that's the subject of this rant. Who is Mandela? Why do you win the Nobel Peace Prize? What's apartheid? And how is he so wildly important to not just South African history, but African history and world history? Because Nelson Mandela, he truly is a living legend and is one of the sentinel figures of the entire 20th century. He is a giant among men. So what's the deal? Because people your age now, and even voting age people here in South Africa, have now gotten distant from Nelson Mandela. Everybody reveres him, everybody respects him, everybody knows he's awesome, but the younger generations in South Africa have no recollection of apartheid anymore because it was 20 years ago almost that this happened. So what was it? What happened, and why is he such an awesome guy? This system called apartheid was basically government-sponsored and enforced racism across the entire society. See, South Africa, like most other African nations, went through a colonial period where the Dutch founded Cape Colony here back in 1652, and the Dutch controlled this area for a long time. Then the British came in and took over the area for a long time. So what you had from the get-go over the last 400 years of African history, in South African history, is a white minority that controlled the vast black African majority of people who were already here. And that's over the colonial period. But let's get up to the modern times. Because once South Africa became independent, the white minority was still in charge. They were still the government. They were still in charge of the armed services. They were in charge of everything. And it was after World War II that this small white minority, mostly Dutch, British-based folks, actually institutionalized racism across the entire country. And that's what's called apartheid, a state of separateness, where they said not only, it's not separate but equal, by the way. That was like the old Jim Crow laws in America, that, oh, well, black people will be over here and white people will be over here, and it's okay as long as it's equal. No, no, no. In South African society, it was full on, nope, we control everything. The white minority controlled everything, including all the resources, all the land, all the government, and everything. And the black African and colored African folks who were here in South Africa were pushed aside, had no rights to land, couldn't own property, were pushed out of cities. The government actually institutionalized this to the point of building townships, cities outside of cities where the black people could live. So this was in effect from 1948, just after World War II. And of course, this is bizarrely, wildly unfair. It's a spit in the face of human rights, of equality, of everything else. And the world from the get-go was kind of like, what? That's kind of weird. And as we get more and more to the modern era, into the 60s, into the 70s, into the 1980s, South Africa actually was kind of isolated on the world stage because of these policies. Even the United States at a point was like, dude, we're not trading with you anymore. You have to get rid of those horrific apartheid segregation laws. This is the modern era. You can't do that. You can't have second-class citizens. And indeed, the black Africans weren't even considered citizens of South Africa during this period. They had no rights to anything. So horrific, horrific abuse, horrific situation apartheid was in South Africa. And that brings us to these two guys, mostly this guy. Nelson Mandela became the world symbol, and it was a worldwide phenomenon, that he became the symbol of resistance, of fighting back against apartheid, but doing it with dignity, doing it in a mostly nonviolent way, and standing up for democracy, for human rights, for individual human liberties, for the whole 9 yards. That's what he was fighting for. He originally started as a lawyer and was part of the initial phase of fighting back against apartheid when they formed this thing called the ANC, the African National Congress. The ANC was actually formed back in like 1912, I want to say, as a kind of a pan-Africa movement of, hey, Africa for Africans, we need to have African pride, and we need to, as Africans, work together to make more equal societies across all of Africa. So the ANC, which is still the main political party in South Africa, started as a Pan-Africa thing. And by the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s, when Nelson Mandela was a young man, they kind of took on the ANC. He was an ANC member, and the ANC started to very quickly morph into not a Pan-Africa thing, but really a South African thing. That, yes, we're going to use this organization to fight back against racism and apartheid here in South Africa. So as a young lawyer, he brought many cases against the government and ended up being actually tried for treason, because while he was mostly a non-violence, let's change our society through non-violent means, he was actually convicted of treason because he played a role in forming kind of a militant wing of the ANC that did some terrorist acts and maybe blew up some government buildings. So he was tried for treason, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison. Life in prison. And this young lawyer then went to prison. He had kids and a family and stuff. The prison he spent most of his time in was called Robben Island, and it's right out here in the bay, in Table Bay, just off the coast of where we're standing right now. And he spent 20 years just on Robben Island, I think mostly in solitary confinement, isolated from everybody else. In all, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, 27 years of his life, and that's critically important. A huge chunk of his life, he was a political prisoner, and he then became the symbol for around the world that people started rallying, saying, "Free Nelson Mandela, end apartheid." Here's this guy who's fighting for democracy, fighting for human rights, fighting for individual liberties. This is a worldwide figure, and indeed he became kind of the touchstone of everybody kind of knew what was going on in South Africa and the rest of the world, because folks were fighting for his release. And indeed, once we get into the 1970s, 1980s is when the society really starts just to blow up. And by blowing up, I mean people had had enough. And the world was isolating South Africa and embargoing it, not buying anything from it. And everybody was like, dude, this is crazy. And enough people in South Africa had been agitated enough and depressed and were oppressed long enough that there started to be protests, started to be uprisings, a whole bunch, I'm not going to go into all South African history, of brutal suppression by the government of any sort of protest and anything. And by the mid-80s, this society was on fire. People were ready to overthrow the government by violent means if necessary, although it was still mostly non-violent. The government responded by cracking down even harder, and so you just had the society in a vice that was ready to blow up at any given second. And basically, this is why I'm going to come back to both of these guys. Because they didn't want the country to implode, the white minority, led by this guy, F.W. de Klerk, he was president of South Africa in the late 80s and into 1990. He, under his government, said, okay, we got to change. All right, this apartheid stuff, it has to change. And the first thing that de Klerk did was say, okay, let's free Nelson Mandela. So Nelson Mandela was freed in 1990 after 27 years in prison. He was freed, and they started working together to form a joint government to get rid of the apartheid laws, which I believe were officially outlawed like in 1990 or 91, but it still wasn't truly a free society until they had the first free, truly free democratic election in 1994, where the ANC political party, the African National Conference, was allowed to be a political party, was allowed to put up a candidate, and of course the candidate they put up was Nelson Mandela. And Nelson Mandela then became not only the leader of the ANC, he became the first president of a truly free South Africa in 1994. 1 year after both of these two won the Nobel Peace Prize for building this coalition, this transition that tried to keep a lid on the society enough to move it towards a free and equitable and fair society without it blowing up. And I know I've already ranted too long. Hopefully Katie can hold on to the camera for a little bit longer. But here's why Nelson Mandela is also considered such a hero and such an awesome human being, period, whether you're from South Africa or anywhere else. Is because under these horrific situations of apartheid for all these years, it is very easy to understand where the black majority, and it's the vast majority, would be vindictive, would be filled with hate, would want revenge. I would, quite frankly. But what Nelson Mandela did was say, here's the deal. We don't want our society to implode. We don't want revenge on the white minority, and we don't want to reverse the hate and discrimination back on the very people who had oppressed us. That's one of the reasons why he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He's a magnificent human being for saying, look, we're going to make this transition, and this is going to be free and fair society for everyone of all colors, That's why he's different. That's why he has made such a huge impact on South Africa and Africa and the world as a whole. Like Mahatma Gandhi, who also actually started his law career in South Africa, Martin Luther King Jr., these are figures that are larger than life in that they see a grander thing going on and saying, okay, look, everybody's going to be equal, everybody's going to be fair. And he also understood that if we allow for, say, revenge tactics and just throw all the whites out or kill them all or persecute them all, then there will be white flight from the country and white capital flight, and businesses won't want to come here. And so we want to maintain our economy. We want to maintain an equitable, real society where everyone is equal. So let's have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And that's also what he was in charge of. We need to talk with each other. Let's just have everybody tell the truth of what happened during the oppressive years of apartheid and have reconciliation, forgiveness. That makes sense? That's why he's such an awesome guy. That's why Nelson Mandela is considered the father of the country, the papa, if you will, much like, say, George Washington is in the United States, the first and greatest leader of a completely independent, free, and equitable state in the modern age, right? And also, like George Washington, or I'm almost done, one more minute. Just like George Washington, the other thing that Nelson Mandela is awesome for is that he stepped down. He was elected in 1994 as president. He was so wildly popular. Again, he was the symbol worldwide and in South Africa for freedom, democracy, individual human rights. He could have ran forever. He could have changed the Constitution to be in charge of South Africa to this day. And he did the right thing. He did the awesome thing. He said, nope, this is a democracy. I'm going to step down after just one term. He could have even ran for a second term, and he didn't. He said, nope, we need to make sure we understand this is a democracy. We don't want South Africa to follow the path of other African states where you have a strong, charismatic leader in charge, and they're in charge for 50 years. We're going to fight corruption. We have to fight, to get economic growth. We have to encourage South Africa to be the rich modern state that it is and a fair and stable democracy. So I'm going to step down. Again, much like George Washington in America. So for all these reasons and 10 million more, Mandela is a hero within South Africa and Africa, but also a worldwide symbol of everything that can be awesome in humans. And let me finish with this. The reason this is still topical to this very second is that the man is 95 years old. He's been hospitalized several times. He's now back at his home, one of his homes, where it is quite obvious that he will pass on at some point in the very near future. And then the question then becomes, what happens next for South Africa? He has been, in my opinion, I think many people I've talked to, Nelson Mandela is so awesome. He's been the glue that's held South African society together since 1990 or 94 when he was elected president. Everyone reveres this guy. Everyone thinks he's awesome. He's done so much for the society and led it forward. But since then, and not to end on a negative note, but the ANC, the African National Conference, the political party that he was a part of his whole life, is the overwhelmingly most powerful political party in South Africa. They get like 60 or 70 or 80% of the vote all the time. But unfortunately, the leaders since the awesome Nelson Mandela haven't really lived up to his level of awesomeness. And maybe nobody could. But almost everybody I've talked to here in South Africa has said, yeah, but the ANC they're corrupt, they're crooked. We fought really hard for independence and freedom and getting rid of apartheid, and this guy was the leader for that, and he was awesome. And then since then, the party hasn't really done that much, and now it's just kind of coasting downhill. But everybody votes for them because they're the awesome party of freedom. They're the ones that helped free the society, so everybody feels obligated to vote for them, even though the leadership is not that great. And the question now is it the ANC itself simply being held together because of the awesome reverence for Mandela himself? And when he passes away, probably soon, what will then happen to the party? What will then happen to the country? Will it fragment, tear apart? I don't think so. But certainly change is underway and underfoot because, and this is, I'll now finish where I started, the apartheid era is now 20 years behind us. So people who were born 20 years ago, that is people who are now voting age, have no recollection of apartheid. I mean, of course they taught about it in school, and of course their parents tried to impart on them how important it is to their history, but they have no real recollection of it. And so more and more young South Africans are more of the opinion of, yeah, well, Nelson Mandela's awesome. Yeah, we learned about him in school. but we want to fix South Africa. We want more jobs. We want a better economy. We want more better services. We want better education. And we don't care. That's nice that you guys were the revolutionary fathers that did all that 20 years ago, but what's going on now? So South Africa is a society that's under some strain because when Papa leaves, no one's quite sure exactly what's going to be next. Not sure what's next for the ANC, not sure what's next for South Africa as a whole. It's largely going to be positive, but change is definitely afoot once the hero of the nation, the father of the nation, Nobel Peace Prize recipient, and one of the greatest legends, living legends of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela, passes on. Does that make sense? That's just a little bit about what's going on here in South Africa from Nobel Square in Cape Town.